All right.
Hello, everyone. This is Mark Dant. I'm the President and CEO of the National NPS Society. We first want to welcome and congratulate each of you for stepping up to be the voice of our NPS community. I want to thank you as well for having the courage to tell your story, because it truly is your personal journey that will change the hearts and minds of many. I also want to thank BioMarin for their partnership on this new initiative, as they too see the importance of you telling your story. Today's webinar is hosted by Chris Hill of Hillside Communications. Chris met many of you at our conference in Columbus this past summer, and I know speaking with him, he's quite impressed with everything you told him there and what your journey will be as you move forward. As Chris runs through his slides, please note any questions you have for him and for the group. In order to keep the presentation moving and on time, Chris suggested that you email your questions to us at the end of the webinar. We will then compile all your questions with Chris's responses into one email and send them out as a group email. With that, I'd like to introduce our host, Chris Hill.
Okay. Sorry.
I think that put my screen up on the webinar. I hope you can all see it. Let me just check with our host. Is it up there where you can see it?
We can see it.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mary. And thank all of you out there who took the time to join me on this webinar. I'm really excited to share with you some suggestions about the kind of stories that you have that will make a difference. I know from Mark that at the end of February, we're going to go to Washington, D.C., and you'll have a chance to share some of your stories with legislatures and lawmakers out there in the nation's capital. The idea, of course, is to get to know those people, but more importantly, to help them understand some of the challenges you face and take those challenges into their law-making efforts, particularly raising some funding and increasing some funding. So there's kind of a purpose. The difference that we hope you're going to make is to change some minds, to change some hearts, and hopefully secure some additional funding for rare diseases like MPS. As Mark said, I know some of you know me. I've actually been working with MPS, with people dealing with MPS, since 2008, when I first went to a patient advisory board in Vancouver, Canada. And since that time, I've done a number of patient advisory boards and gotten to know some of you very, very well, heard your stories. And then, of course, last July, I did something a little bit different from just standing at the front of the room and introducing speakers. I had a chance to actually conduct a presentation skills class with this good-looking group of people here in Columbus. You can see yours truly standing at the back. Somehow I'm always at the back of these photographs. It must be the height or something. But we spent some time talking about how you get the word out. I had a ball. I had a good time. And it was out of that workshop that we came up with the idea that maybe we could work together before you speak to your legislatures. And we'll do that in Washington, D.C. with a live face-to-face meeting. But this webinar is really a chance to just quite briefly get you thinking about the stories that you might tell when you go to Washington. And so the idea here is in about 30 minutes, just give you some ideas about what makes your stories so powerful and how you can make those stories truly make a difference. Because the fact is, you all have great stories. You all have great stories. And stories are a wonderful way of communicating information. And personal stories can be very powerful. Personal stories can be very powerful for three important reasons. And the first and probably most important reason that stories are so powerful is because as far as your brain is concerned, it can experience a story as though it were experiencing actual events. Of course, you know the difference between the real world and something that you're thinking about or something that you're imagining. But at some level, your brain doesn't know the difference between something that's happening to you right now and something that you're hearing and thinking about or something that you remember. So if you can recall a particular experience in your life that was emotional in some way or other, happy, sad, surprising, your body will actually experience what you're thinking about just as though you were back in the past experiencing that same event in real time. The other cool part about this is that because we're humans, and this seems to be kind of just a human thing, we can actually do that with other people's stories. So it's possible for us to actually kind of live someone else's experience. If they tell that story to us, we can kind of picture ourselves in their story. And good stories do exactly that. Good stories allow the listener to see themselves in the story. Now, I don't know whether you've been involved in this particular series of stories. I think Harry Potter had 7 books and 8 movies. I think I've seen one of the movies, but I can't admit to reading one of the books. But I know they were enormously popular. You know, people would queue up for hours before the books went on sale, and people would stand there in their capes and their hats with their wands. I mean, they were Harry Potters. They were actually seeing themselves in the story. Once they'd been to the movie, once they'd read the book, it's almost as though they were the wizard, the hero of the story. And that's one of the powerful things that makes stories so powerful. Stories also draw the listener in. That opportunity to experience someone else's story, if it's a good story, has that way of drawing the listener in. It helps them focus. It helps them tune out distractions. And I'm guessing at some point you've had that experience where you've been listening to somebody tell a story, or you've been reading a story in a book, or you've been watching a story on TV or in a movie, and it's like the world around you drops away. You become completely a part of the story that you're listening to. You know, it's too bad that teachers in school don't use stories more. I'm guessing you've also sat and listened to many, many presentations by your teachers, perhaps your professors, and all the story is, well, it's not even a story. It's just a series of facts. It's really hard for you to keep your attention. You kind of have to keep reminding yourself to tune in. But sometimes, every so often, you have a teacher who tells what they have to teach in a series of stories, and it's the easiest thing in the world to listen to. The rest of the world drops away, and without even knowing it, you're learning just by listening. So what we're trying to get you to think about today is, of all the stories that you could tell in Washington, D.C., which are the ones that are not just powerful, but actually have a lesson? Because good stories not only draw the listener in, but they also give the listener a chance to learn from what's going on in the story. I don't know whether you've had a chance to see this movie yet. My wife and I went to see it a couple of weeks ago. This movie is Hidden Figures. And it's the story of 3 African-American mathematicians who were a part of the space program back in the 60s. It is amazing how powerful these characters were. And it proved to me that you don't have to be absolutely like the characters in the story. You don't have to be the hero to still learn an important lesson. There were lots of lessons in this movie. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. But basically, when these women started working for NASA, they worked in a segregated, separate building from the rest of the engineers. And it was only because John Glenn, the astronaut, was trying to circle the Earth for the very first time, that NASA realized they didn't have a mathematician that could do the calculations. And one of these ladies stepped up. During the course of the movie, every one of them got to overcome challenges. They got to get more involved in the program. And it was I don't know if you've seen it, it was a great movie. So good stories allow the listener to learn from the characters in the story itself. And of course, as you're telling your story to the people in DC, that's the objective for you. Can they see something in your story that they can learn from? Whether they're learning about MPS, whether they're learning about some of the things you have to deal with, or learning how their funding efforts could help you, think about the stories you might want them to take away from what you say. So let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about how your stories will get results. What can we do to make sure that there is a real outcome? Because, you know, they will listen to you, and I'm sure they will enjoy what you say. But when you're gone, when we all leave the meeting, what will stay behind? What are the results that will live on? What will the legislators do when they've heard your story and you're no longer there? Well, this is where we have to think about something different. Not just stories, but a plan. How can we put our stories into a plan, a simple plan, that will lead the listener, your listeners, to something that they will do differently from what they've done before? So let me share with you a little simple plan that actually we've been teaching to the people that we work with for years. It's a simple 5-step plan, and here it is. Step 1 is think about the logistics. Where, when are you going to be telling your story? We'll go into this in a little more detail in a moment. Consider your listeners. Step number 2. Who are you talking to, and what matters to them? Step 3. What's your objective? What do you want to happen when you've told your story? What is your objective? Step 4. What are the key facts? For the person you're talking to, obviously they'll enjoy your story, but what do you want them to remember? Identify those key facts if you can. And then step 5, when you've thought of all of that, that's the time to actually pick the right story from all the ones that you could tell. Let's go into these in a little more detail. Logistics. I mean, this is straightforward, common sense stuff. Between now and the end of February, it might not be a bad idea, if you can, to find out who you're meeting. You know, who is it? Are you going to meet a staffer? Are you going to meet the actual legislator? I know some of these details aren't ready yet, but hopefully by the time you go face-to-face, they will be, and they are important. When are you going to meet the person you're scheduled to meet? Plan ahead. Get there early. Where will you be? Again, same thing. If you know where the meeting will take place, you can make sure that you can be there on time, if not earlier. Now, the last 2 questions of logistics are quite important. How many people and how long do you have? There's a big difference between talking to one person in kind of a conversation and speaking to 2 or 3 or more. We'll talk about the differences actually when we do the face-to-face training in Washington, but it would be good if you knew that before we started that training. And then, of course, how long do you have? You may get 15 minutes or so, but you may not. Is your story, is your plan flexible enough to get shorter or get longer if you need it to do that? Again, in the workshop coming up, I will show you how to do that. But just keep those things in mind because they sort of set you up for everything else that follows. Now let's turn to step 2, and step 2 involves your listeners. Of course, ultimately, it's the listeners that are going to do something different when your story is over. So let's make sure we answer these 4 questions, if we can, before we go to see them. What do they want? What's important to the person you're talking to? Question number one. What do they know? What do they know about you, about MPS, about rare disease funding? Where are you starting in terms of the knowledge level of the person that you're meeting? And then more importantly, what don't they know? What are the gaps in their knowledge about you, about MPS, about rare disease funding? What do you think they don't know? I mean, you know this better than I do, but it's worth thinking about. And finally, what do they need to know? Same thing about you, about MPS, about rare disease funding. The thing I heard you, the group I worked with in Columbus, what I came away with is what people need to know is we're just people like anybody else. Maybe that's one of your need to knows that you will take with you to your DC meeting. Step 3, your objective. What do you want your listener or your listeners to do or think differently when you're finished? And could you say that? When I'm done, what I want them to do is X. There'll be a call to action at the end of your meeting. And what are you going to ask that person you're talking to do when you're done? Now, of course, to change behavior, you've got to give people some facts. Simple, clear facts they will remember. So when you think about those need to knows, what are the 2 or 3, maybe 4 things that your listener must remember? Because as you're telling your story, those are things that you will sprinkle throughout your story, emphasize those key facts, make sure that the story communicates those key facts as clearly as possible. So we've done 4 steps, starting with the logistics, through the audience, your objective, and the key facts. And then, step 5, finally, choose your story or stories. Which ones will give you the best opportunity to communicate the key facts that will get the outcome that you want, that will make the difference? All right, let's go back to thinking about the stories. Again, I'm sure you've got a million. But let's think again about what makes a good story. A good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And these parts are very important. And they're important because, again, what you're trying to do is make it easy for the listener to be a part of your story, to leave their world behind and get into yours. So that always starts with a good beginning. Who's the main character in your story? Is it you? Is it your parents, your family, your teachers? It doesn't have to be that we don't have to learn from the hero, but it should be clear who the story is all about. Where does the story take place? In your home, in your school, in your work? Again, don't forget to leave these important facts out as you're setting the stage for the story you're about to tell. When does it take place? You know, is your story about when you were 2, when you were 3, when you went from kindergarten into elementary school? Is it about your college life, balancing work? Think about those things. And again, lastly, every good story has a main problem. Something that gets the attention and the focus of the person that's listening. Is there something in your story that you share early on that will draw the audience in? Every good story has a problem at the beginning. I'm not the Harry Potter expert, but as I recall, his Earth parents didn't even know that he was a wizard, and they would kind of lock him under the stairs. I'm guessing that was a bit of a problem for him, and that kind of draws the audience in. What's he going to do about that? Can't live under the stairs for the rest of his life, but what's going to happen? Well, of course, if we do a good job of setting up the beginning, we then go to the middle, and this is where the good stuff starts. This is where your story, a good story, should build suspense and tension, suspense and conflict, because those are the things that are going to arouse the curiosity of your audience. And gradually, your story should move to some kind of event, some climax, some turning point, some solution that releases the tension that's been building up in the middle of the story. And then finally, in the end, when everybody's breathing a sigh of relief, you can close with the lesson learned and, most importantly, the call to action. Based on the story, based on the solution, what are you asking for when you're done? What is your call to action? Now, good stories also have other things in there. Good stories have emotion. You know, it's emotion that makes a history lesson come to life. When you're telling your story, it's not just a series of facts and events. I was, things that happened when I was this age, and then this happened, and then this happened. Good stories also have emotion. If it's your story, don't miss the chance to put some life into it. Tell the listener how you were feeling at each of the events that you were talking about. Tell the listener how the character was feeling. Put some interest in there. Let them experience it just like you did. But let's not forget, good stories are also short, simple, and clear. Could you tell a good story in 5 minutes? Could you tell a good story in 2 minutes? Don't get bogged down in the details. What is it they say? The KISS principle, K-I-S-S. Keep it simple, stupid. Don't make it hard for yourself. Make the story short, simple, and clear. 2 good short stories are better than 1 long-winded one. So think about that as you're thinking about the workshop that's coming up in DC. And good stories also have surprises. There's nothing better for getting the audience's attention than giving them something they don't expect. So, if there's an opportunity for a surprise, even a joke, something the audience doesn't expect, don't miss the chance to put that into your story. That's what will make your stories come to life, and that's what will keep the audience engaged before you ask them for what you want. So, that's it. What I've given you today is some simple tips and recommendations so that as you prepare for our live workshop in Washington, D.C., you can think about the stories you will bring. We'll probably have a lot more information for you by the time you get there, but if you could, between now and then, think about the stories that you're going to tell and have them ready to go by the time we have our face-to-face workshop. What I hope I've done today is just give you some suggestions. But before I close, let me simply review. And by the way, this presentation has been recorded, so I believe if you need to, you can go through and listen to it again. But I've tried to keep it short, simple, and clear. Let's review. Have a plan. This is a 5-step plan. Think about the logistics. Consider your listeners. Consider your objective, your point B, the key facts you want to communicate, and lastly, the actual story or stories that come at the end of that planning process. If you have a plan, you can't fail to not only impress the people you're speaking to, but give them something to do. And then finally, as you think about your story, think about what makes a good one. It should have a beginning, a middle, and end, even if it's short. It should have emotion, happiness, sadness, even anger. As long as the emotion is real, don't miss the chance to put those in your presentation. It should be simple, clear, and brief. It should have simplicity, clarity, and brevity. The chances are you probably need to tell the story out loud at least 2-3 times before you realize how much more simple it could be. Take the time to do that if you can. And then finally, it should have some surprises if there are any. This presentation really doesn't have any surprises. All I need to do today is thank you all for giving me your time. I wish you the best of luck coming up with your stories, and I can't wait to meet you all in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Excellent presentation. As a reminder to all the listeners, if you have any questions, please forward them to our Communications Director, Mary Erskine, at mary@mpssociety.org. And then if you will, give us a few days to compile the questions and gather the answers, and we'll send a group email out probably within a week. So with that, I'd like to again thank Bob Moran, our sponsors for the NPS Speakers Bureau. I'd like to thank Chris Hill for his work, and thank also Mary Erskine, our Communications Director, for working to help make this webinar work so smoothly. I know we'll be seeing many of you in Washington as you take your message to the Hill. So thank you again for your help. Have a great evening.